In typical From fashion, Season 3, Episode 2 pretty much tells you everything you thought you worked out last week is wrong.
I think this place has gotten in my head now.
However, at the same time, this episode is filled with tons of new clues and reveals, and we've even got some pretty cool theories to throw your way.
I think you're here for what's in the basement.
So grab your talismans and lock your doors as it's time to break it down.
There's a good chance we are not coming back.
Before we jump in, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed today's video, and remember to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to keep up to date with the rest of our From coverage. Now, with all out of the way, let's get into From Season 3, Episode 2.
Don't. Somebody has to go and see.
So we left off with Jim venturing deep into the woods in search of his wife Tabitha, feeling it's the right thing to do given she's the mother of his children and they, now more than ever, really needed their mum. Of course, Kenny, being one of the nicest guys in town, takes it upon himself to go with him as he knows all too well what it's like to lose a family member there to those creatures and wouldn't wish it upon anyone. However, this time, Kenny's good deeds come around to bite him as he wasn't there to take care of his mum, Tian Chen, when all hell broke loose that night in the town. With all of their crops gone, their sole food source now was the animals, and the entity that's tormenting the townsfolk knew this to be the case as the monsters moved to release the livestock into the streets, causing Boyd and the others to rush outside during the night to try and retrieve as many as they could. However, this all turned out to be a trap as the creatures figured out they'd try and bring some of the animals back into the barn and waited for him inside. This is when Kenny loses his other parent whilst Boyd is forced to watch. This time around, the creatures really have upped the ante and they seem far more sentient now than before, which we'll get onto a bit later. Now, this time out, things take a turn as Kenny awakens after spending a night in one of the huts they came across whilst travelling through the forest. And if you checked out my breakdown of the season premiere, I think this is actually another town trapped in this bubble. However, the inhabitants of it have long died out. We've even got those creepy carvings surrounding its perimeter, which I think is their attempt to keep the creatures out, almost like a talisman. Anyways, Jim calls him outside as they found fresh crops growing by the river, which I don't think is a coincidence, which we'll dig into more throughout the video. Tabitha wakes up on Henry's sofa, which is Victor's dad, and understandably he isn't buying into the story she's trying to tell. She tries to convince him by giving him a lowdown of the town and how she ended up there, even going as far to search up the people that were stuck like the boys and the Chens in a bid to prove it. Tabitha finally has a breakthrough with him though once she mentions the trapped children, as it turns out Victor's mum, after a wild night at home with certain substances, began to have dreams of the town herself, with the children also appearing to her. Not only does this show us again that the town's reach extends beyond the bubble it's in, but also that the people there were probably selected rather than at random, which I feel is a very big reveal in terms of the overall mystery, and it's one that might actually hold the key to escaping. Now, we know Victor's mum had a connection there sometime before her arrival.
You're actually telling the truth.
And Victor's defied the odds by surviving there as long as he has, often at times on his own. Now, I think the town is effectively acting as a mirror in that it selects someone and projects what they're most afraid of. I wouldn't be surprised if Victor became aware of his mum's dreams by overhearing his parents talking about them or seeing the countless paintings in the basement, which then became a fear of his, and then once he became stuck in the town, that was then projected. We know the town's history stretched way back, but that's also why I believe it wasn't totally created by Victor, but rather it's something he became trapped within, with his fears then becoming the new reality there. There are a lot of elements in this town that seem to come from the mind of a child. Let's think about monsters being their biggest fear to start with, all the way to electricals working without a connected wire. Kids see electronics working, but they don't often question how. And then, of course, there's the faraway tree. The idea of teleporting through magic trees feels like it came straight from a fairy tale. I think the whole idea of the town feeding off of emotions too ties into this theory quite nicely. If it is actually a projection of a person's mind, right now being Victor's, that explains why he's been kept alive for as long as he has, acting almost like an anchor for the town as such, in that if he died with no one there to take his place, it might cease to exist. I wouldn't be surprised if the last anchor died around the time Victor arrived, and likewise once Victor dies, someone else will take his place. Anyways, Boyd, after spending a night handcuffed to a pillar in the barn, is clearly suffering from the horror of Tian Chen being ripped apart in front of him as he wheels her body through the town. It didn't help that he was collared by Donna and confronted over the fact he risked lives and lost one with Tian Chen over choosing to get the animals out of the street.
We are all we have.
Her argument here, and I totally get it, is that their lives are worth more than a few animals, some of which they weren't able to save anyway, and that they needed to stick together, which of course is true. However, looking further afield, Boyd definitely made the right call in the end. If he didn't try to save their only food source from wandering into the forest, then there might not be anyone around by the time the new crops arrive. Now in the street, Jim and Kenny make it back to town with the good news of more crops. However, it doesn't take long for Kenny to pick up on the somber tone, eventually realising he had now lost both of his parents there. Understandably, he takes it pretty bad and he heads into the diner for some alone time. But really rubbing salt into the wounds, the jukebox flicks on and begins playing Celebration Time. Now, there is some humour buried deep within that, and this could be totally at random. However, I actually think it's the dark forces at play that are literally taking the mickey out of him. Meanwhile, over at Colony House, Fatima's going through a rough time with morning sickness, and I think once we get there, this pregnancy will bring about a big change in the town. For me, there's no chance the baby isn't one of those little monsters just waiting to be born. The real question now is, though, what exactly happens to the person carrying one? As we see Fatima pulling a tooth from her mouth with relative ease, almost like she's decayed herself.
Fatima, you're scaring me. Come on, can you please open the door?
They take a trip to see Christy, who's not there. She's a bit preoccupied with the shock death of Tien Chen. To be fair, a lot of this episode is about the aftermath of that, but she's told by Muriel, who just so happens to be a pediatric nurse, that she's severely malnourished. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier about people being selected to come into the town. Rather than ending up there at random, Muriel, a pediatric nurse, arrived just before it came out Fatima was pregnant. I wouldn't be surprised if everyone in the town is there for a specific reason, just with a lot of them yet to figure out exactly what that is. Right now, I can't help but wonder if Muriel being sent there was actually a positive, which we do get at times, for example, with the boy in white and Jim finding new crops by the lake, or if she was sent there to ensure whatever is growing inside of Fatima survives. During editing, I've just realised that shortly after Fatima leaves the clinic and tries to get back into Colony House, just before she eats the spoiled crops, she can't get in. The door's locked as a talisman on the other side. So I think at this point in time, Fatima's actually transforming into one of those monsters. Anyways, Christy, with the help of Jade, somehow manages to fix up Tien Chen, enough for Kenny to see her, and to be honest, from where they started, that seemed like an almost impossible job. As you'd expect, Kenny's taken things pretty badly and intends to follow through with what he suggested in last week's episode of taking the fight to them. Playing more offensive rather than defense, he gathers a ton of alcohol with the idea of taking it into the monster's cave where they sleep and torturing them. I don't know, this to me feels like something I would have considered doing myself a long time ago. But anyway, Boyd catches him taking the alcohol before agreeing to go along with him.
Okay, let's do it.
Now, I feel like Boyd's pretty much at this stage now as well, but the spookiest part of all this is, you don't know how many times going more offensive has been tried before. Now, arriving at the mouth of the cave, Boyd reveals to Kenny that his mum wasn't alone in her final moments, that he was with her and he was forced to watch as it happened. She was brave, and he recites her last words to Kenny that she spoke in Cantonese, which ended up being for Boyd to look after her son. They were her final words, and her last thoughts whilst being ripped apart went to Kenny.
He'll be alone now.
This clearly struck a chord with the both of them. For Boyd, knowing torching the cave was a dangerous game, as it could risk retaliation like nothing they've experienced before. And for Kenny, he also knew this could be a one-way ticket to the grave, and he was leaving Boyd unable to fulfill his mum's final wishes. Now, this didn't completely put a pin in their plans to go on the attack for a change. Instead, it cooked a much smarter strategy as Boyd enlists the help of his son Ellis to actually try and capture one of these monsters. Realising they're far more sentient than initially believed, their idea is to interrogate and torture for more information, kind of playing them at their own game with what they pulled at the barn. Anyways, just as we thought the town had enough to deal with this episode, Jim's phone mysteriously rings, almost like an episode of The Chase, where he answers to a young-sounding voice on the other end calling him Dad and claiming to be Thomas. Of course, Thomas, we know, was the child Jim and Tabitha lost after he fell from a baby table, and it was this pretty much that ripped the marriage apart in the first place, with them set to go their separate ways before being stuck in the town. Initially, it's easy to write this off as the dark entities playing more games, trying to get into the town's head a little bit, like with Kenny and the Celebration Time song in the diner, but from what we've seen so far, we also can't rule out the possibility of Thomas continuing to grow up in spirit and now being able to communicate with his parents whilst they're in that place. It wouldn't be the first time the town's demonstrated the ability to do the impossible, but they could also take things a step further with that and actually bring Thomas back, alive and well, into the town. And then I could see the situation occurring of if they leave, they'd also have to leave Thomas behind, as he wouldn't be able to leave that place. Now, whatever this is they're dealing with, and as I mentioned earlier, it feels like a projection of Victor's or a child's imagination for the most part. There's definitely more layers to it than that. It's almost like a game show of sorts. They've all got their respective roles to play. Whilst the game does its best to tear them apart both physically and mentally, they'll be put on the brink of defeat. Taking their food sources away was a big part of that. They'll lose pillars of the community like Tien Chen, and this will all heighten tensions and pit them against one another. But then, almost like clockwork, if they can make it through that initial part, a solution presents itself. It's essentially like a twisted reality game show, and like Donna said, it's almost certainly rigged.
No matter what hand you play, you lose.
They just need to figure out the right way to play it. It's clear the writers have been dropping clues throughout the whole series, with things definitely heating up this time around. So now I want to know, have you spotted anything we've missed? And after this week's episode, what do you actually think's going on? As always, drop your thoughts, theories, and wilder speculations down in the comments below. Leave a thumbs up on the video if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to catch more. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.